Alright guys, this set of video notes covers the 4 main protists that you guys have to learn about. Those protists are the euglena, amoeba, paramecium, and the volvox. So before we talk about what a protist is and how the different protists move and reproduce and stuff, we have to talk about how it's classified as a living organism. So anything that is considered living is an organism, okay? So all living organisms meet this criteria. They have to be made of cells, okay? It can just be one cell, it can be many cells. Either way, they have to be made of cells. They have to be able to get energy from a source, from food, from the sunlight, whatever, and then store that energy to use it. They have to be able to grow, so start small, get bigger, or either reproduce itself. They have to be able to respond to the environment if there's changes in the environment and in turn adapt to those changes in the environment. And then they have to be able to reproduce. Now they can reproduce asexually, which means they don't need another partner, and they can just reproduce themselves on their own. Or they can reproduce sexually, which means there needs to be 2 of that type of organism. So what exactly is a protist? A protist is one of the less complex organisms that we're going to learn about, but they still have many different characteristics. So there'll still be different ways that they move, different ways that they get energy, different ways that they reproduce. So there's still specific characteristics to these organisms, even though they're not as complex as other organisms. They do meet the criteria of being a living organism, so protists are living. The first type of protist we're going to talk about is the euglena. All of these different protists that you're going to learn about live in water. Some of them are freshwater, some of them are saltwater. So the euglena specifically is going to be living in freshwater. Okay, so these are your lakes, your rivers, your streams, things like that. They get its energy 2 different ways. They are a producer, or another word for that is an autotroph, meaning they can make food on their own. And they do this by the whole process of using sunlight to capture energy. And they can also be a heterotroph. Hetero means other, so heterotroph meaning they can get energy from other organisms or other things, okay? So they're a producer or autotroph, meaning they can make their own food, or they can also turn and be a heterotroph, which means they get their energy from other organisms or other things. And most euglenas contain chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is this greenish color that you see here in the euglena. It's a pigment that turns it a green color, and these specific protists do have chlorophyll in them. So something unique about the euglena is that it has an eye spot, which I'm going to circle right there. Okay, so that little red eye spot helps them sense light. It can be moving along in the water, and if something moves over top of it and blocks the sunlight, it knows just by the darkening of the light around it that there is something surrounding it. So this eye spot helps them sense light changes and be able to tell what is exactly around it in its environment. The euglena gets rid of its waste through something called a contractile vacuole. When you think of contractile, I want you to think of something contracting. So squeezing tight and opening up, squeezing tight and opening up. That's what contracting is, okay? So a contractile vacuole is just the storage area inside the euglena that holds excess water. And whenever it's ready to remove this water and remove waste, what it does is it opens up to let it out, and then it closes again. So contracting is opening and closing, and a vacuole is like a holding area. So whenever it's ready to release that water and remove the waste, all it does is open, let it out, and then close again. The euglena moves by flagella, which you can't really tell in this image, but there's like a little black tail, like that I just drew, on the back of the euglena, and that's called a flagella. A flagella is just a fancy scientific word for a whip-like tail. The way that I remember it is I think of a flag on a flagpole, just kind of waving in the wind. and that's kind of like the flagella in the water. It just kind of waves back and forth in the water and propels the euglena and helps it move. For reproduction, the euglena is an asexual reproducer, specifically through binary fission. The prefix bi, right here in binary fission, means two. So what it's pretty much saying is this type of protist can reproduce itself without having another partner. It does not need another euglena. What it does is it just clones itself and makes two. Okay, so you can see in this picture, this is one, this is one. This one right here is kind of morphing itself through binary fission and turning into two. It will eventually break apart right here in the middle to form two separate euglenas. Okay, and that's through binary fission. The euglena can kind of move its shape around easy to help it move. You'll see here it's more of an oval shape, and then here where it's reproducing at, it's more kind of blobby. All right, so it can change its shape around depending on what it's doing. And here is a nice detailed picture of the euglena. It shows you all the different organelles in it. Here's that contractile vacuole that opens up and releases waste and stores things. The eye spot that we talked about that senses its surroundings. There's the flagella, which is the tail. It has a nucleus inside of it, which is just the control center for the euglena. It tells the euglena what to do. And then it also has chloroplasts, which, remember how we talked about, it can be its own producer of food, and that would be through chloroplasts and the whole photosynthesis ordeal. The next protist we're going to talk about is the amoeba. This is actually one of my favorites. The amoeba is found in both freshwater and saltwater. So your rivers, your lakes, your streams, your ponds, your oceans, all water places this type of protist can be found. Most of the time it's around dead and decaying material. So if you have a pile of leaves in the corner of the water by the bank, they're usually there. If there's an organism that's dead or decaying in the water, you can typically find the amoebas around there. These are really cool because to get its energy and to continue thriving, it's like a parasite, okay? So what that means is, think about a tick on your dog. The tick sucks the blood from the dog, and the blood gives the tick energy to survive, okay? So it's considered a parasite. Now the amoeba is considered a parasite as well, meaning that it gets its energy by invading other organisms. So it's not sucking blood per se like ticks do, but it does attack other organisms to get its energy, okay? To get rid of its waste, it also has a contractile vacuole that just opens up and closes to release the waste that it doesn't need anymore. And to move, the amoebas use cytoplasmic streaming and pseudopodia. And I'm going to explain both of those very well for you. So cytoplasmic streaming, you can see in this picture right here. All of this, I'm just going to put dots in it. All of this gel stuff is called cytoplasm. Alright? And cytoplasmic streaming is whenever the cytoplasm just kind of moves and morphs around, and the amoeba just kind of streams around wherever it wants to go. It can change its shape, it can morph, it can move around objects, all through cytoplasmic streaming. And then it also moves by pseudopodia. The prefix pseudo, right here, means false, okay? And pod means foot or feet. So pseudopodia is false feet, and they're just little sensors underneath of the amoeba that helps it sense things and move around, okay? For reproduction, the amoeba reproduces the same way as the euglena, and that is asexually through binary fission. So they do not need another amoeba to reproduce. It can just pretty much clone itself and break itself off into two. This is a detailed picture of what an amoeba looks like. Here's that cytoplasm I was talking about. Remember how it moves through cytoplasmic streaming? That cytoplasm just flows and morphs around to change shape, and that's how it moves. It has some food vacuoles here that store its food, and the contractile vacuole here, which opens and closes to release waste. It also has a nucleus, just like the euglena, which is the control center for that specific protist, so the nucleus tells the amoeba what to do. And then there's also this thing called a cell membrane. If you see, it points to the very outside of this amoeba. So the cell membrane goes all the way around the amoeba, and it pretty much keeps everything in place, and it's a flexible barrier that lets things in and out of the amoeba. Okay? Alright, so the next one is our paramecium. I call this one the hairy potato, just because it's weird shaped like a potato, and it has little hairs all along the outside of it. So I call this my hairy potato. The paramecium is found in fresh water, alright? Rivers, lakes, streams. They are our most complex single-celled organism that we are going to learn about. They get their energy through something that we call cilia, and cilia is just a fancy word for tiny hairs. Okay, so you can't really see what I just wrote, but it says tiny hair. And these are just little tiny hairs that are all around the outside of the paramecium, and what they do is they catch nutrients and gather food, and they sweep it right in here to the food passageway and into the paramecium. To get rid of the waste, the paramecium has an anal pore, and this is just a small area on the paramecium that gets rid of the food waste that is, or the solid waste that's captured by the paramecium. And then it still has that contractile vacuole that we've been talking about that opens and closes, and that releases the water waste for the paramecium. The way that it moves is through cilia, and I'm going to highlight here how you see all those little hairs on the outside of this paramecium. Those little hairs are called cilia, and what they do is they sway back and forth in the water to propel the paramecium forward or backward or side to side, whichever way it's trying to move. And remember that the cilia are responsible for also capturing the food and the nutrients for the paramecium. The paramecium is a sexual reproducer, which means there has to be two parameciums, alright? It cannot do it on its own. It has to have a partner to reproduce. So it is a sexual reproducer. It has two nuclei. We've been talking about with all the other protists so far that it has a nucleus or a control center within it. Well, the paramecium has two. One is a big nucleus and one is a small nucleus. So the prefix macro stands for big, and micro stands for small. So the macronucleus is a big nucleus, and the micronucleus is a smaller one within it. So this is a picture for you to refer to. Here's the cilia that we were talking about, all the little hairs on the outside that capture nutrients and that move the paramecium around. Here's your vacuole that stores things. Your anal pore, which gets rid of the solid or food waste. Your contractile vacuole gets rid of your liquid waste. We have our macronucleus and our micronucleus. So see how your macronucleus is much larger than your micronucleus? Okay. The last protist you guys have to learn about is the volvox. The volvox is found in ponds, ditches, and puddles. What they do is they form in colonies. So there's never just one. They all clump up and form in these huge colonies. And they're tiny flagellate cells, which means they have tons of flagella, alright? So there's all these cells put together in a colony. They move by flagella. They travel together. They are commonly called what you guys would know them as green algae. So whenever you see the green algae clump up in your pool after you haven't cleaned it for a long period of time, that's volvox, okay? To get its energy, the volvox uses photosynthesis. So we know that photosynthesis is when it uses the sun to capture energy, okay, that the cell can use. And then it also has flagella. It's like the little whip-like tail that we talked about with the euglena. And the flagella help bring in nutrients into the volvox. The flagella also will help the volvox move too. So it has multiple roles. The volvox also have an eye spot like the euglena that helps them sense light and figure out what's going on around it. We talked about on the last slide how the flagella helps gather nutrients, but it's also a big key component in moving the volvox. The flagella is what sways back and forth in the water to get the volvox moving. Something cool about a volvox is they are an asexual and asexual reproducer. So if they want, they can reproduce themselves. If they don't want, they can find another volvox and reproduce that way, which is sexual reproduction, okay? This is a picture kind of zoomed in that shows you exactly what the volvox is and the different organelles within it. So here we have the flagella. So these two little areas right here, the two little tails coming off. So it moves around by the flagella. It has an eye spot that senses things just like the euglena did. Chloroplast, which uses sunlight to convert energy for the volvox, has a nucleus that tells the volvox what to do. And it also has a contractile vacuole, which gets rid of that waste that we always talk about, okay? And this is just showing you one tiny part of this huge big whole, because we know that volvox form in colonies. There's never just one. So as you can see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth, all the way across, okay? So they group up into colonies. This last slide just goes over all the organelles that we talked about, and it tells you their specific role within the protist. So cytoplasm in protist is that gel-like substance inside of the cell that kind of holds those organelles in place. We talked about how the amoeba moves by cytoplasmic streaming, which is the next one, and that's when that gel-like substance, which is the cytoplasm, flows and moves around inside of the cell to help that organism move around, all right? All of the cells had contractile vacuoles, which opened and closed to release waste. The flagella was that long whip-like tail. I said to remember like a big flag swaying in the wind. It's a long whip-like tail that helps the organism move around in the water. The flagella was specific to your euglena and to your volvox. The cilia was the fancy word for short little hairs that move back and forth to help things like the paramecium move. There were pseudopods, which also stood for false feet when you break the word down. And those were part of the amoeba, and they helped the amoeba move, as well as cytoplasmic streaming. You have the nucleus in all of the protists that help control the cell. It's the control center. It tells the cell what to do. There were chloroplasts in a few of them, which is where photosynthesis occurs, turning that sunlight into energy that the cell can use. There were some of them that had an oral groove, especially in the paramecium, how it had that opening where it would gather food with the cilia and sweep it into that oral groove, or the mouth area, which you would think of if a person had an oral groove, it would compare to our mouths. So the oral groove in a paramecium is just the opening where it sweeps nutrients and food into. And then the last organelle I want you guys to remember is the eye spot. They talked about it a little bit in volvox, but it's very particular to a euglena because it helps it detect light and its surroundings around it. All right. So make sure you filled in your tables for the notes. And if you have any questions, see me in class.